Hi, I'm Wendy Murdoch, and this is Webinars with Wendy. I've been doing a series of webinars during the pandemic to entertain myself, visit with friends, meet new friends, and learn something. This is a number 122. If anybody told me when I started doing these that I would have done 122 at this point, I would have said they were crazy. But that's where we are. And hopefully at some point things will get better. But in the meantime, we'll just keep doing webinars. And I have guests lined up all the way into December. We're going to take a little break over the holiday. So just be sure to keep an eye on that. We'll send out the emails and let you know who our guests are. Today, my guest is Alicia Harlov, right? And she is the author of The Humble Hoof, which I just love the name. I think it's great. And your logo, I love your logo too. I almost used that for something. It's really great. So welcome, Alicia. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And as Wendy said, my name is Alicia. I am a hoof care provider just north of Boston, Massachusetts. And my main focus is barefoot rehab, but I also utilize boots and pads or composite glue-on shoes as needed, depending on the case.
So Alicia, how did you get into this? Like, how did you get into hoof care in the first place?
Yeah. So funny story, and I'll try to make it as short as possible.
That's okay.
I was a public school music teacher. I have a master's degree in music education. I taught for about 10 years in the public school, and I had a horse that had that was diagnosed with a navicular, and basically I had no idea what to do with him, and you know, my amazing farriers, I don't want to say it was any fault of theirs, but you know, nothing was really helping him. So I kind of got sent down this rabbit trail of, studying ways to help navicular issues. And that's how I actually first learned about Dr. Bowker, who I know you've had on a few times,
Yep.
Pete Ramey, Daisy Bicking. I flew to a hoof rehab in England called Broccoli Farm. And eventually
with Nick.
Yes.
Yeah, we've had her on twice.
Yep, I love Nick. So I've been to her rehab in England, and then I helped coordinate a clinic for her in New York last year. So, and hopefully we'll see her next year too. I think she's coming back to Denver, Colorado for the.
Oh, great. Yeah, people loved her webinar.
She's just so incredible. And it got to the point where I was spending I probably shouldn't admit this publicly, but I was spending all my prep periods at work in school studying hoof issues. And I didn't think that was fair to the students that I was teaching. So I eventually left teaching, and this is my full-time career now.
Wow. So what instruments do you play?
I majored in orchestral percussion, so mallet instruments, but you know, as a music ed major, I had to take lessons on basically every instrument in order to be certified to teach them. So now
you understand concussion, you know, isn't that percussion? It's all about concussion.
Yeah. Right. The funny thing is that percussion's a very mathematical thing, and hoof care is not. So it's definitely an adjustment. But it's been fun.
Okay. And so how long ago did you leave the education system? Well, you're still in the education system, but leave the formal education system teaching to start doing this full time?
So I've only been doing this full time for just over a year, but I have been for the last 5 years trimming. So I was teaching and then trimming after school and on weekends and driving myself crazy busy. And now I actually have no idea how I managed to do that, teach and then trim.
You know, we find ways, don't we? We all find ways, like with the pandemic, we find ways to connect. So, and then when did you start did the Humble Hoof start initially when you first left teaching, or how'd that come about? Because it's a great name.
Oh, the actual business name or the podcast?
Both of them.
So the name, I bounced names around with my husband and one of my really close friends for a while, and I wanted something that would encompass the fact that I really believe that the hoof is smart and that it's smarter than we are, and we can impose our ideas on it, but ultimately the horse and the hoof are going to have the final say in what works for it. But I also didn't want to pigeonhole myself into, just barefoot or just one way of doing things. And so I thought, the Humble Hoof says, it's going to be teaching us things instead of us trying to force our own ideals on it.
Yeah, it's a great name. And so when did you start doing the podcast?
I started the podcast in, March of 2019. And it started with just one episode a month, just because, I didn't have time for much more. And it got picked up by Horse Radio Network a few months ago. So now I do 2 episodes a month, which is slightly overwhelming at times. Just because I edit all the episodes. It can take me 10 to 20 hours of editing.
Yeah, no, it is time consuming. And we had Glenn on the webinar because on one of my shows, and he talked about how podcasts typically are not terribly successful if you look at the masses of podcasts that have been created. And so it was interesting to talk to him about how he kind of scans and see whose podcasts are being successful and who's diligent and really sticking with it, because really it's the consistency that's so required to make a good podcast. I mean, Glenn, has been and we want to give a shout out to Glenn because we know he's got some health issues going on right now, and we're just sending him a lot of love.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be back, but he's needing to take care of himself right now. So, so cool. So you started this podcast, and apparently you have a lot of viewers or a lot of listeners, I'm going to say, because when we put up the email for this webinar, things went nuts. I was like, wait a second.
It's so funny. It's funny because I don't, the podcast episodes themselves aren't me. They're whoever I interview. So that's cool that I do know the podcast right now gets around 8,000 to 10,000 downloads a month. And the slight variation is usually just, I think, the topic and the guest that I have on. But
well, people seem to enjoy your interviewing process because they're saying you're the best. So,
thank you.
It's so much of this, the online stuff, and I'm sure that you recognize this. There's a lot of people that are using online right now, but I've tried to listen to other people's online stuff, and I just find that unless you're a bit of an entertainer, and like me, I interrupt my guests all the time and ask them questions, it can kind of get really flat. It can get really tough for people to watch, and so much is being driven online right now. So I will interrupt you, ask you questions. I'm actually going to run your slideshow, so this is going to be really fun.
Yes, thank you.
I can say, no, I'm not going to go next to the next slide just yet. All right, are you ready to get into it?
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to do the screen share here. And that's not what you want to see. It's this one. Nope, that's not it either. It's Facebook. Where the heck did it go? Wait. Nope, that's not it. Okay, wait, I got it. Why? Hang on a second. I'm going to stop my share for a second and figure out why that didn't work, because it worked just fine a minute ago when we tested it out. That's the joy of live.
I have it too. I just don't know.
I know what I did. Hang on. You have to talk and entertain the crowd while I switch my account, because it does. I can't ever. Google doesn't like the fact that I have 2 accounts. And so if I'm going to look at like you sent me something on Google Drive,
yes.
It does not like the account that I sign into everything else with. So it signed me out. So now I'm going to sign in with the account that it likes. There we go. And hit present. So there's always, like I said, the joys of figuring out the internet connections, but we've got it now. No problem. All right. And let me just get the presentation. There we go.
Perfect.
Cool.
Awesome. So as the name states, I want to talk a little bit about the owner's role in hoof rehab, meaning what can you as the owner do to help your horse succeed in rehabbing to soundness. And before we even start, I actually chose this picture that's shown here for a specific reason. This horse that's in that picture with the shoe on the top picture,
yep,
he was actually set for euthanasia. He had an appointment to be put down due to chronic long-term lameness. And a client of mine actually offered to take him in because she was, for whatever reason, so confident that we could fix him just by looking at his feet, that she offered to take him. And before, she was a long-term client of mine. She was actually one of the first owners that I ever worked with. And she, before I even met the horse, already did a bunch of the things that we're going to talk about today, in, changing his diet, making sure he had a good environment, having, boots and pads ready for him to be comfortable in once we pull the shoes. And, with incorporating those things, I think it made the process of rehab a lot easier. And I absolutely don't think that we would have been successful without her incorporating those things. And he actually came back to soundness and was able to be a working trail horse, taught some little kids how to do walk, trot, canter, small cross rails. So he's definitely a cool success story that I don't attribute to myself at all. I think that was all the new owner who did that. So we can actually go to the next slide.
Okay. Let's see. I have to figure out how. There's got to be an easier way for me to go to the next slide.
Can you press the arrow? Yeah.
Okay. I'm used to Google, so that's the tricky part, but I'll get there.
So as we said when we were talking a little earlier, I obviously wasn't always a hoof care professional. I knew nothing about hooves or soundness when my gelding was diagnosed with navicular. And I was given the prognosis of, keep them comfortable until it degenerates too much. And then you just have to put him down or eventually, or retire him or eventually put him down. And I am stubborn and I didn't like that answer. But I found that navigating the diagnosis with my vet and my farriers was pretty difficult. Everybody has their own idea on which direction to go. And I was relying on them to fix my horse, basically. I was assuming that my farrier is going to come in and do whatever he needed to do to get the horse sound, and I just had to watch. But I realized that the professionals I was working with, they aren't seeing the horse every day. Like they weren't seeing my horse, and going through the ups and downs that I saw every single day. And I realized that what I did was going to play a huge role in his comfort and his rehab to get him as sound as possible. So, that's when I started learning more about ways that I could influence the rehab process. So obviously, disclaimer, I'm not guaranteeing any step-by-step process. I'm not saying that I have like a 12-step program to success. But I do really believe that the success rate in rehab is strongly influenced by the owner. And even more so now as a hoof care provider, there are times when I want to tell owners, if we can't incorporate these changes, you can fail with somebody else. It's not gonna be successful.
But I think this is really important because so many owners kind of feel at the mercy of their equine professionals and are unaware or uncertain in many instances about what they can do. In the past, horse people were more engaged with their horses all the time. Horses were more part of our lives. And then, of course, they moved away to where we live in homes and they live in barns. But I think we're starting to realize now that we really need that interaction. We really need to be our horse's advocate and to take on that role of being part of the process, not observing the process.
Right. And I truly believe horse owners know their horses better than anybody else. They see them all the time. They know what's normal for them and what's not. They know how they react to different things. Sorry, my dog has decided that right now is the time that she needs my attention.
That's okay. We have lots of animals cruise through webinars.
Yeah. So I really think that owners don't give themselves enough credit in knowing their own horse and knowing what's working and what isn't. So we can go to the next slide. And this one, I admit, will be a lengthy slide for sure. So one of my favorite quotes is from Dr. Thomas Teskey: "The healthiest hooves are attached to the healthiest animals." And I really believe that. That saying of "you are what you eat," I think that absolutely relates to horse hooves as well. And I can talk about this topic for a really long time, so I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. But I truly believe that nutrition is like a crux of so many rehab cases and their success. And I think it can make or break rehab if you don't have a diet that supports the soundness of the horse. So I am going to spend a bit of time talking about nutrition. So Pete Ramey is someone that I've learned a lot from. He is a farrier down in Georgia who also focuses on barefoot rehab with composite glue-on shoes. A phrase that he uses often is that feet are like a canary in the coal mine. So they're going to give us, feet are going to give us warning signs long before we see any kind of, catastrophic failure to the horse's soundness or movement. And once we start paying attention to these signs that they're showing us, we can, mitigate issues before they actually become a lasting problem. So one big thing I think feet tell us are nutritional issues that are causing hoof inflammation, even if the horse isn't outright lame. So whenever I go meet a new horse, the first thing I always look for are, event lines on the hoof. You can see in this picture, the lower half of that hoof definitely has some event lines there, the ripples. And I also check the depth of the collateral grooves, which are those grooves that are next to the frog. The event lines can give an indication of inflammation in the lamina, little insults that are causing, some low grade inflammation in there. And the collateral grooves are really good to be able to tell the sole depth of the horse and how well the hoof is suspending that coffin bone inside of it. So I'm probably going to sound a little crazy, but unless you already know me, you've probably heard this before. I don't put a lot of weight on genetics in terms of hoof quality. I think that, issues with sole depth, issues with sensitivity, hoof wall quality issues are all symptoms of a bigger problem. And I don't just say, oh, that horse has genetically bad feet. Oh, it's an off the track thoroughbred, they have bad feet. I don't think that's necessarily true. I've seen plenty of horses that people might attribute to having poor quality feet get really nice feet with a good diet. So I think obviously there are genetic issues that might play a role, but not as much as we would think. So before I do anything with any horses that I see, I always talk to the owners about diet. I seek to get all the horses I see on a forage-based diet, which means I do ask owners to feed less or no processed feed or grain. During hoof rehab, I basically treat horses like a laminitic. Even if they're not laminitic, I feed them as if they need to be fed as a laminitic horse. This can really rule out a lot of lamina inflammation as a cause for hoof sensitivity or issues in their growth, or being ouchy over various surfaces. So I really try to have all the feed that a horse eats be less than 4% starch, and less than 10% of ESC, so ethanol soluble carbs, which is basically sugar, and starch combined. So that's a little different than NSC. It's a little more specific. I follow the ECIR way of feeding horses, which is Dr. Kellen's Equine, Cushing's, and Insulin Resistance Group. And she goes by ESC and starch. And usually now, a lot of products will list a separate starch and a separate ESC on their label, so you can check both of those. And it also might mean testing hay for really sensitive horses. If I come to a horse that's laminitic, I usually recommend owners test hay. And really testing hay and balancing minerals to it is the best thing you can do, but I know it's not feasible in a lot of boarding situations. Should I answer this question that just popped up?
Sure.
Yeah, so fructans. So Chris Pollitt is a vet and professor out in Australia, and he talks a bit about fructans and how he did a study with inulin where he actually injected or tubed in inulin into these horses to say that if they ate so much amount of fructan, he can make them laminitic. So the only thing is that and I hope I'm not totally botching this study because I don't have it pulled up. The amount that he fed was a crazy high amount that a horse would never usually eat day to day. And it wasn't even a form of fructan that horses would naturally have access to. So,
fructan being a sugar, a form of sugar.
Right.
Like fructose found in fruit.
Dr. Kellen, so there's no other studies that actually link fructans to laminitis. Dr. Kellen has a lot of discussions on that. Yeah, right. Fructose and fructan aren't the same thing. What's
the difference then?
What's the difference? They're two different kinds of carbs, and I actually don't know the actual difference.
Okay. So fructan, to me, fructan sounds like fructose, therefore I assumed it was a similar sugar, but it's different?
Yeah, they're different.
Okay.
There are different, thoughts or camps on this. There are some people who are very, die hard into keeping fructans low or going by NSC, going by the WSC and hay and making sure that's low enough. Dr. Kellen in her database has over 20 years of case histories with, hundreds, if not thousands of horses. And they've found that the horses that they see, just going by a low ESC and starch, has horses controlled for laminitic rehab. Yeah. Sorry, I'm reading these. If people wonder why I pause, I'm just reading these questions that pop up. Yeah. So I'm sure others can expand on that more, but I've seen really good success with just going by ESC and starch. Granted, most of the hay tests I've seen in my area in New England, and really a lot of the worldwide tests I've seen haven't been overly high in WSC, water-soluble carbs. But even so, I haven't had issues with the horses that I've seen feeding them less than 4% starch and less than 10% ESC and starch, personally. And I do work on a good amount of actual long-term chronic foundered horses. And they've been able to be managed with just looking at ESC and starch. So sorry, that was a little bit of a side note there.
That's okay.
So for a carrier, instead of, if you're taking grain out of their diet, but you still want to feed minerals, obviously, a lot of minerals come in powder form. So, sorry, someone just asked about ESC. So ESC is ethanol soluble carbs. It's sugar. And less than 4%, I look for starch to be less than 4%. And ESC plus starch to be less than 10%. And that's, it can be pretty strict. But if you're really in early stages of hoof rehab and your horse has a lameness issue, I'm pretty strict on that because I see the best success rate that way.
So basically you have the owner have their hay tested to find out what the ESD and the is in the hay, and then do something about that?
So a lot of the owners I see actually can't test their hay. I'd probably say about a quarter of the owners I see can test their hay. Luckily in my area, I see enough hay tests that in my area, I absolutely cannot guarantee this for other areas. I know a lot of the hay guys, and they'll cut in the morning when sugar is low. I've seen a lot of hay tests where the ESC, the sugars are actually less than 1%, and the starch, I don't think I've ever seen starch in any hay near me less than 4%. So I'm usually pretty confident with the clients that I see that their hay is okay. And if a horse is having a laminitic issue and the owner can't test hay, then I usually tell them to soak it. So soaking it will lower the sugar levels. It won't lower starch levels, but it can lower sugar levels, which is helpful if the horse is having an issue with the sugars in the hay. But even products like grain, even some like pelleted supplements, or even some forage-based feeds they should list their ESC and starch right on the package. So a grain can have something like 11% starch and 9% sugar, or ESC, and that just wouldn't be safe to feed in any amount to laminitic. But really, I tell owners I don't think that's safe for the beginning of our rehab if we really want to see the best results possible. So instead, I'll have owners use something like a Timothy grass pellet. For easy keepers, Timothy balance cubes from Triple Crown are actually pretty good. Speedy Beat, and I like the Speedy Beat it's a UK product, and I think it's processed a little better than some of the other beet pulp
So that's
products.
a beet pulp. Yeah, and there's a lot of problems with the GMO beet pulp that you have to be careful of. I wonder if
Yeah.
UK one is better.
And I'm 99% sure, someone can correct me on this, that Speedy Beet is non-GMO.
Yeah. It's hard to find non-GMO in the US.
Yeah, it is a UK product, and it's, you know, especially for easy keepers, it's cost effective because you don't have to feed a ton. For easy keepers, I actually just have owners feed just enough of the carrier so that they can get the horse to eat the minerals that I want them to eat. And one thing a lot of people will ask me is about alfalfa, and this is a little bit of a hot topic, but I personally will have owners not feed alfalfa in the beginning of rehab, especially. I've seen way too many horses that I swear, even a few bites of alfalfa causes foot sensitivity that resolves the second they remove the alfalfa. So I don't have them feed that. It is low in ESC and starch, but it's a legume. It's not a grass. Right. And I do have a podcast episode talking about alfalfa and why it might cause hoof issues if people are interested. And for harder keepers, I always have owners increase hay. If they're getting free choice hay and, you know, other things incorporated like ground flaxseed or cool stance copra or more Speedy Beet, or even in some cases like a little bit of Triple Crown Senior Gold, which is low in sugar and starch, a little higher in fat. If they still aren't, you know, holding their weight, I'll have owners test hay, because if hay is low in protein or low in, you know, digestible energy or calories, then nothing we're going to give them is going to meet their nutritional, you know, calorie needs for the day, and they're going to have a hard time holding weight. So the calorie content and the protein in the hay can really affect a hard keeper. But otherwise, usually a fully forage-based diet is fantastic for 90% of the horses I see. And I did see that some questions pop up, and I didn't catch them in time.
That's okay. I can just come back and take a look at it.
One was about
is non-GMO, and she has a bag in her living room, as well as Timothy pellets. That's really good to know, because the GMO that can really throw things off.
Yeah.
So you don't recommend alfalfa as cubes or pellets, correct?
I don't personally, or alfalfa hay. In the beginning of hoof rehab, I want to preface or do a little, you know, caveat of there are lots of horses who do great on alfalfa, and I'm not on like an anti-alfalfa, you know, mission, but at least in the beginning of hoof rehab, until you can test to see if a horse is comfortable on alfalfa. I have owners remove it just to make sure that's not halting progress. I know this sounds crazy, but I've seen feet clear up thrush, have tighter white lines and less sensitivity, just from removing alfalfa from the diet. But again, there are lots of horses that do really well on it. It's just, if we know that there's hoof issues, I want to kind of do an elimination diet to start, to make sure that.
I mean, that's what we do with people, right? If you have an allergy to something, you do an elimination, and then test back later after you get things under control. Yeah.
Right. So this horse that's pictured with the crazy foot, he went from eating grain as the main source for all his grain and hay as the main source of all his nutrients, to a fully forage-based diet of just a few months prior to me taking that picture. When I met him, and you can actually see that top half of growth. It's just so much tighter to that, you know, if you're looking at the coronary band where the hairline is, it looks so much tighter to that coronary band. And then all of a sudden, halfway down, it flares out like a bell. Where it starts to flare out, that's his old foot growing out. So we can't change anything about that. It has to grow out, it has to grow down, but you can see where he has the event lines, and it's just so much more flared. His angles, you know, he had these terrible underrun heels and this huge flared foot that I'm hoping by the time that new growth hits the ground, he's going to have this nice, tight, comfortable foot with better sole depth. So, you know, we talked about vitamins and minerals like super briefly, and the best thing I would say to do is, if you can, test your hay, if you have a reliable hay source, or if you buy hay in quantities where it makes sense to test it and make a custom supplement to that, that is the best thing you can do, because you know what the hay is providing in terms of nutrients, and then you can just meet the deficiencies with a supplement, and it's going to save you money that way. I was never able to do that in a boarding situation. We got a new delivery of hay like once a week or twice a month. And it didn't make sense for me to spend $30 every week just to have to then only feed supplements for a few days and have to change it. But there are there's a good, yes, I do love the Rockley diet. I see that Allison just mentioned that. There are a handful of really good supplements that are a good kind of safety net that can cover a lot of the deficiencies that are seen in, common hay tests for different regions. And just before anyone asks, I don't know if anyone will, but I don't like Farrier's formula. I don't like any of those generic hoof supplements. If it's labeled a hoof supplement, I probably don't like it. But one main issue that we see, without getting too much into the sciencey side of things, is that hay tests around the world and water can be really high in iron. And for the average size horse, the NRC daily recommended amount of iron for like a 1,000-pound horse would be around, I think, 400 milligrams a day. And at least in my area, I have not seen a hay test that provides less than 1,000 milligrams a day if you're feeding for 2% of body weight in hay, which might not seem like an issue, like more is better, right? Except that iron has been linked, correlation doesn't equal causation, but there's some link between iron and metabolic issues and iron and laminitis, and iron itself competes for absorption with copper and zinc and some other, necessary minerals. So, the hoof needs copper and zinc to be healthy. And if the body is just absorbing iron, it's causing all these, issues in the body from not getting the minerals it's supposed to, which we then see in the feet.
Is that something you can test the horse for, the iron levels?
You can. You can't. So there's only one lab in the United States, I don't know about other countries, that actually does an accurate test. It's the Kansas State University can do a KSU iron panel where they test serum iron, ferritin, and TIBC. And you can do, Dr. Kellen has some mathematics that you can do. Hair analysis, I don't recommend. I know someone just commented that. Hair analysis, even Dr. Kellen doesn't recommend it. It's not accurate for, different hair on different areas of the body will have different results. Taken at different times a day has had different results. And, it's going to be in the past anyway, because it's whatever's growing out. And so I don't personally recommend hair analysis for that. So the KSU iron panel, Dr. Kellen has some math that you can do to figure out if they're iron overloaded. But even if the horse isn't iron overloaded, clinically, the balancing the iron has done huge things in terms of rehabbing feet that I see. So I can pretty much guarantee that any grain bag or most supplements that you can pick up at a store will have added iron on the back, and that can just sabotage your hoof rehab goals. So if it has, it provides 100 milligrams of iron and 100 milligrams of zinc, well, you just canceled out whatever zinc you're trying to feed. So, there are a few supplements that I like in the States. You just have to choose one. I'm not like a brand Nazi. Vermont Blend is really good for my area. California Trace Plus is a good one. Mad Barn makes one called Amino Trace Plus, which is also available in Canada. Arizona Copper Complete, Lone Star Trace, Colorado Mix. There's a lot of really good options now. And most of these were formulated with specific regions in mind based on average hay tests, but they're pretty much safe for anywhere. The only thing you really need to worry about is selenium levels and manganese in some cases. Like my area is really high in manganese, which I wouldn't then supplement manganese because it can actually increase iron absorption, which is not what we want. In the UK, I saw Allison had mentioned it, but Progressive Earth Pro Hoof is one that I like. Forage Plus also makes a lot of really cool balancers in the UK. And in Australia, and I assume New Zealand as well, you can get Carol Layton's mixes. So, obviously there's lots of countries that I left out.
Let me see if I can just kind of recap this. Is basically different regions of the world in the country have different levels of minerals. And so a lot of horses could be overloaded in one and lacking in another. And what we basically have to do is balance out that mineral profile so that we have to counter the high iron. Is that what you're saying? By making sure we supplement with something that's going to sort of balance out the iron. In other words, you can't remove the iron, but you can supplement with copper and zinc. Is that what you're saying?
Right. So, I mean, there's other minerals that we take into account, but the biggest ones are, for the hoof that I like to see are iron, copper and zinc, a ratio of, this is a really tight ratio, but a ratio of 4:1:3. So iron, copper, zinc would be 4:1:3. And usually that means supplementing no iron and then bumping up your copper and zinc so that gets to that ratio. I've seen added magnesium be a huge, impact in hoof sensitivity and nerve and muscle.
In a good way?
Sorry, what?
In a good way?
Yes. Yeah. In a really good way. I think Nick Barker in your webinar with her talked a lot about magnesium as being kind of the key to success in a lot of her rehab cases. And it's usually pretty safe to supplement orally. The first symptom of too much magnesium is loose poop. So if your horse has any kind of manure issues, you can back off. And somebody asked about Remission. Remission to me is a really expensive magnesium supplement. I mean, you can get magnesium for pennies a month if you buy it in bulk. And Remission, I mean, it's not super expensive. I think it's like $10 a month, but the other products, the other minerals in it aren't super, helpful in the ratios that they have in that supplement. But the magnesium can be bought for so much cheaper. So Remission isn't awful. It's just, more expensive than you probably need to spend.
Okay. So you've mentioned a lot of ratios and for the person who's not necessarily mathematically minded, what is like a simple, easy step that they can take in terms of starting to address this issue of the nutrition and balancing out the minerals?
Yeah, so I usually just say cut out grain, start with a forage-based carrier, and supplement one of these base supplements so you don't have to do any math.
Okay.
Yeah, and I also recommend vitamin E for every horse. Even if a horse is on grass and you say they're getting vitamin E, I recommend it as a little safety.
Somebody particularly true in your colder climates where, like, we have grass that looks like spring here right now.
Yeah. Somebody had mentioned magnesium citrate versus oxide. Actually, Dr. Kellen has done some preliminary research that oxide is much more absorbed in horses than it is in people. So anybody who's using like another form of magnesium because they think it's more absorbed are going by human studies, and oxide's actually very well absorbed or fairly well absorbed in horses. There's an article by Forage Plus on different forms of magnesium and what's absorbed the best. And they actually said oxide is cheap and it's absorbed pretty well. So they choose that over chloride or citrate or glycinate or the other, or malate, the other forms. And I've seen pretty good success with magnesium oxide. That's actually what Rockley Farm feeds, like a calcinized magnesite, which is, a form of magnesium oxide. So I don't worry too much about the other forms. They're a lot more expensive usually too. So I usually start with the less expensive first. I like to save people money.
That's great. There's some questions in the Q&A that I can't get to because I'm sharing my screen right now. Maybe you can click on the Q&A.
I think I've been answering questions as they come up.
Okay, I'm just checking because I can see the chat. I just can't see the Q&A questions and they haven't gone away. So,
I don't know.
Well, hang on. I'll just stop share for a second, check them out. Brandon, people are just asking if you can repeat some of the names of supplements. And just remember, you can go back and watch this webinar on the Surefoot Equine YouTube channel. So it's not like it disappears at the end. But
yeah. So some of my favorite ones, Vermont Blend, California Trace Plus, Mad Barn has Amino Trace Plus, which is also available in Canada. And I don't know of any other options in Canada. So if anybody else does, I'm always looking for more that are good. Arizona Copper Complete, Lone Star Trace, which was formulated for Texas, and is really high in vitamin E. Colorado Mix, are just some, and they're, they all have free shipping across the country that I've seen. And most of them, I would say, average between $25 to $50 a month. I feed one that's $30 a month, but I don't feed any grain, and it's pretty encompassing and matches the hay test for my area. So I find $30 a month to be totally reasonable.
Okay, so we have a question if there's enough magnesium oxide in the Vermont Blend.
So Vermont Blend, I think, has 6 grams. And obviously it does depend on your hay test and your individual horse. I've fed, I really want to be careful because I don't want people to do anything that's harmful, but I personally have fed up to 20 grams of magnesium as needed for my own horse. And, usually I feed it to bowel tolerance. And obviously in cases of long-term magnesium supplementation, you might want to check your hay test just to make sure the magnesium and calcium and phosphorus ratios are pretty good. But Nick Barker has said it too, and she's been doing this a lot longer than I have, that she hasn't seen any detrimental effects of magnesium supplementation. I just want to be really careful that I'm not gonna, cause anybody issues. But
and then there's another question about some magnesium supplements say low iron formula. Does this mean we should go for that option?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little more expensive. I know that mybesthorse.com has one that's really low in iron. There are some, if you open up a bag of magnesium oxide that's sold by like the 50-pound bag and it's red, I probably would look for a different option. The kind that I feed is almost like I guess sand might be a different color depending on your yard, but it's like a brownish, tannish sand color. But I have had people open up a bag. It was like a reddish pink, like a darker pink, and they sent it out to be tested, and it was really high in iron. I mean, it's going to be minimal, probably the amount of milligrams it adds per day. Like the hay is going to be supplying way more iron than your, magnesium, but, just to be safe, it's the same reason I tell people to not feed Himalayan salt, which is pink. It's not going to give you a ton of iron a day, but it's just not needed. And you can feed plain white salt, and it saves you money and meets the needs of the horse.
So there's another question. There's another veterinarian who advocates straight soybean meal as an amino acid source. And she's just saying thoughts, and understand if you don't want to step into that.
Yeah, I haven't. I do know who that vet is. I actually have some clients that use that vet as a dentist. I haven't really explored that as much. I will say I do have some horses that I see that are sensitive to soy and become footsore on soy. So I think that
got the GMO problem with most soy. I mean,
so I think it's definitely something you want to watch for. If you're not seeing the hoof results that you want, I would start picking apart everything you're feeding, and if it's, species appropriate.
Okay, so we're going to take 2 more questions, and we're going to go on with your presentation, because otherwise
I know the diet weight part was supposed to be a small part, but
somebody's asking about iron and Speedy Beet.
There is, yes. So basically everything we feed, Timothy pellets, Timothy cubes, Speedy Beet flax, it's all going to have some iron in it, which is not added. It's just intrinsic iron. If you soak the Speedy Beet, rinse the Speedy Beet, soak it, and then rinse it again, it brings the iron down to basically nothing. And that's usually what ECIR recommends to do for feeding. But if you're feeding like, a half a cup of Speedy Beet to get the minerals in, the amount of iron that's going to be given through that Speedy Beet is maybe you'll add 10 milligrams of iron from the Speedy Beet, but if you're getting 1,000 milligrams a day from the hay, it's kind of like, okay, it's a little inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but you can soak, rinse, and it does take care of a lot of the iron.
And then there's just a question about natural versus synthetic vitamin E.
Yeah, I personally like natural vitamin E. If you feed synthetic, you have to feed something like a third, like 33% more to get the same amount of absorption in IUs. I really like, there's a water soluble E called M-Cell, which is very cost effective. It's a liquid, and it has to be added right before you feed. So a lot of boarding situations might not be ideal. They might not feed it that way. But that is a water soluble natural E, and water soluble just means it doesn't need a fat to be absorbed. So if you're feeding a vitamin E supplement and you don't have any fat in the diet, the horse probably isn't utilizing that vitamin E unless you're feeding a water soluble source of vitamin E. That might be, I'm getting in way deeper than I meant to in terms of.
We're going to go back to the slideshow because people are still asking questions, but I said I was only going to take 2 more. So we're going back.
And people can, if you, I was going to mention this at the end. There's a Facebook group that I help admin called Equine Nutrition Group. You can feel free to join there and ask questions. There's another really great group, Hoof Care and Rehabilitation that I help admin. So any lingering questions, if you want to ask them there, we try to, check those a few times a day.
Okay. All right. So going back to the slideshow.
We'll try to fly through some of these so we're not like going too long.
Oh, and I might have to let somebody out in a second, but we'll see. Okay.
So other factors obviously can affect hoof health, like stress, which stress also leads to gut issues, which affects absorption of minerals. So to me, it all comes back to nutrition. Movement affects hoof issues. So this horse pictured, I met him just over a year ago, September 2019, and he came from a more stressful situation. His new owner, who was a client of mine, gained ownership of him. He had those event lines, toe cracks in all 4 feet. So she changed his diet, put him out 24/7 in a herd, and his whole demeanor changed really, but his feet just grew in so much healthier and he's so much more comfortable. And I didn't do anything special with his trim. So when I say that the owner plays a huge role, I really do think that the owner plays a much bigger role than what my trim does. I try to say to make the horse's life as species appropriate as possible. So, moving, socializing, and, forage available. And really, we're going to talk a lot about movement. I'm seeing clients that seem to have a roadblock in hoof rehab. I'm seeing that movement plays a huge role, like proper movement throughout the day. It can really affect how their feet grow in. I mean, just like with us, if we're not using our muscles and using our body, it'll atrophy. The hoof, if they're not using that hoof, it's going to atrophy. So we can go on to the next slide. So this Thrush is a personal enemy of mine. So something that owners can really help with is treating Thrush and learning to recognize Thrush so that you don't have to wait until your farrier or hoof care provider comes to point it out. The pictures that you see are actually of one of my really good friends' horses. He is a chronic Lyme case that foundered and was shod for many years. I pulled his shoes. You can see on that top left picture, he had that little split in between his heel bulbs in the middle of his frog. We call that a central sulcus infection. And then the picture on the right was just a cycle or 2 later after treatment. And actually the bottom picture was his other front foot. So he had this central sulcus infection in both front feet. So I have a whole podcast episode devoted to Thrush and what it's caused by and ways to influence it and ways to treat it. So I won't get too deep into it. You can listen to that in the podcast. But I see Thrush come from nutritional issues like too much sugar and mineral imbalance, meaning the body's not strong enough to fight off those pathogens and microbes, and environmental issues, and not so much like a muddy paddock. A lot of people think, oh, it rained and the paddock's muddy and now my horse has Thrush. if a horse is on a good diet, I'm going to keep saying diet, I don't see thrush pop up even in muddy paddocks. What I will see is if a horse is in a stall a lot in like pea-soaked shavings or like standing in its own manure all day long, I do see that really affecting the frog. So for environment, I'm talking more like nasty, manure or pea that they're standing in, and not mud necessarily. And one thing I really want to drive home is that thrush does not have to be some black gunk that has a smell. If I see a frog with a split in it like that, or if the frog has anything more than a thumbprint in the middle at the back there in the central sulcus, I'll have owners treat until that is nice and open and the frog is no longer deep there. So even if it doesn't smell, even if it doesn't seem like there's an issue, I'll have owners treat it. So thrush itself can actually lead to lameness. It can cause toe first landings, poor movement, which actually toe first landings can cause soft tissue damage from improper biomechanics, which can lead to bone damage. So you can have a lot of issues that come up with something as innocent as thrush. So I'm a big stickler on it with owners. So I've actually seen horses that will nerve block sound to a heel block. Like if you have the vet come out to find out where your lameness issue is coming from, their nerve block sound to a palm or digital nerve block in the back half of the foot. And so the vet will say the horse has a navicular diagnosis, that all of a sudden the horse came up sound once the thrush was gone. So, I'm pretty strict about thrush. And somebody just asked what I treat with, so we can go to the next slide because we'll talk about thrush treatments. So I've used a lot of different products, and I'm sure there are a million out there that do well. I keep these 3 products, the 3 Red Horse products on the top there, in my car at all times, and I do sell them to owners too. So I haven't used Life Data Clay. Somebody just asked about that. So for really deep infections, like the ones you saw on the previous slide, I like Hoof stuff. It's basically cotton fibers with honey and zinc oxide. So it's super, benign in terms of, it's not going to cause any issue or stinging. It shouldn't sting, but it's really, really effective and stays in really well. I also like their Artemud or field paste, and I find both of those are pretty effective, and it's really what the owner feels most comfortable using. The field paste is a little thinner and stickier than the Artemud. The Artemud is more like a thicker clay. And if owners don't have access to Red Horse products, I tell them if they have any diaper cream, like Desitin, it has to be 40% zinc oxide, so the maximum strength. It's actually really pretty good. All of the Red Horse products have the 40% zinc oxide in it, which I think is really the secret ingredient. So those are kind of my hacks for treating thrush. If I notice that the foot is really weak and there's, white line issues, any thought of abscessing, or the thrush is really, really just insidious in there, I will have the owner do like a clean track soak or white lightning, or oxine AH. Someone mentioned adding copper sulfate to Desitin. You can. Copper sulfate is very effective. I'm very careful with copper sulfate because it is a carcinogen. So I just I don't use it often.
And you can use Desitin to stop any horses chewing on wood because it'll stop them cold better than anything else.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I used to have a horse that would, you just put Desitin. It looks ugly because it's white, but it'll stop them cold. Yeah, they don't like it.
And I've seen thrush cleared up with just the Desitin, so I haven't felt the need to add the copper sulfate. I will sometimes add copper sulfate under glue-ons or something where I know I'm not going to be touching that foot for weeks and weeks. But it's pretty strong stuff. I know that Pete Ramey loves it, and I know that it's used very, very commonly in the farrier world. I'm probably just more cautious than others. And you can see this picture here on the left. That's my gelding's foot. That's my Mustang gelding's foot. That is what I would say is a healthy frog. So those heel bulbs are nice and wide. It's like a heart. They're not, the top of the heel bulbs aren't touching. There's no split. There's no little holes in his frog. And that frog is actually, if you look at the widest part of the foot, that frog is just a little, it's, you know, almost as wide as the widest part of his foot. It's a fully functioning weight-bearing frog. So that's what I kind of strive for as much as I can. Horses that have long-term contraction in their feet sometimes have the inner structures remodeled to that contraction, which can mean that their foot won't open up that much. But I've seen some feet open up a lot just from treating the thrush and getting them moving better. So we can go to the next slide.
When I go to the next slide, I'm going to let Buster out because he's otherwise going to continue to annoy.
Okay, that's fine. So one thing I'll ask owners to do, obviously if they're not in any kind of glue-on package, is check the feet often. So especially in cases of laminitis, I'll have owners feeling the feet and checking for this digital pulse. So this picture here is from Paige Post's website, Anatomy of the Equine. It's not my photo, but I credited her there. You can feel a digital pulse right above the fetlock. And remember, a horse's pulse is slower than ours. So if you don't feel anything, it doesn't mean they don't have a bounding pulse. I usually like to hold my hand there for a while to make sure I didn't miss a heartbeat. If I don't feel anything there, I'll go down to above the coronary band, and see if I can feel anything closer to the hoof. Somebody asked about if their feet are colder. You know, so I do think that every horse, and I could be wrong about this, has a different normal for how warm their feet are. I live in New England and it gets really cold in the winter, and feet will feel warm in the winter just because the air is so cold that the horse is alive. So it has some, you know, it has blood flow in the feet and they feel warm. That's just because their feet are warmer than the air. But I've seen horses who, you know, if they're standing in the snow all day, their feet are cold. So you know, Dr. Bowker talks a bit about circulation and how shoes affect that, or how standing on different surfaces affect circulation. So that's something you can watch some of his webinars or videos about. Let's see what I was. Oh yes. So, you know, I have owners check for heat in digital pulse often and learn what's normal for your horse. So if you know that you can feel a very faint digital pulse all the time and your horse is sound, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. I worry about the bounding pulse that feels like throbbing. In those cases, if you normally can't feel anything and you feel something, you might want to talk to your vet or farrier or hoof care provider. And also don't freak out if you feel a digital pulse after your horse has been running around, because that's normal. If your horse has been trotting around outside or chasing a buddy, they're going to have a pulse in their feet. If they've been standing in the sun, their feet can feel pretty warm, or at least in cases that I've seen. So it really, you have to think about, have they been in turnout? Have they been moving a lot? Have they been in the sun or the shade, to really know what's normal and tell what's, you know, good or bad for your own horse. And I do have owners pick out the feet often. I always say that dirt plugs can be really good. They can provide sole support and stimulation to that frog and help generate tissue and strengthen the frog. But muck plugs, like manure and pee and other junk, are really bad and very detrimental. So when in doubt, I just have owners pick it. If you don't know what's under all that muck in the foot, I have them pick it out, just to make sure nothing bad is going on in there. I don't know if Wendy's back, but we can actually go to the next. Oh yeah, you can go to the next slide.
Yep.
So most of the rest of this webinar is going to talk about movement and how to watch your horse's movement, and I'll try to make this not super drawn out, but it's important. So one catchphrase from Nick Barker, who has Rockley Farm Rehab, is movement isn't bad, but improper movement is bad. So, you know, think about physical therapy. When you injure yourself, like say you have a soft tissue strain of your own and you need to do physical therapy for it, they're not telling you not to move. They're teaching you to move in a way that's going to be healing to that injury and correct the cause of the injury. So when we see horses with improper biomechanics, that can lead to stress to the soft tissue and cause repetitive strain type injuries. So this, horses that are constantly landing toe first, for example, they're jamming up that soft tissue and causing soft tissue strain. And unless you correct that movement, then it's going to keep re-injuring, and you're not going to have success. So toe first landings, I think we mentioned this very briefly, can come from discomfort from a whole bunch of things. It can come from thrush. So if you have thrush that's not treated, the horse isn't going to want to land on its heel, and it'll land toe first. And that something as simple as thrush can lead to a much more serious issue. But toe first landings can also come from dietary issues. Like if they're having inflammation in their hoof from, high levels of sugar and starch, they're going to, in a lot of cases, they might, shorten their stride because they're sore. They're scared to really fully bear weight on their feet and land toe first. Trim issues can cause toe first landings, or of course, internal pathology. So if they have, they already have some kind of soft tissue injury in their foot or bone damage, they might be more predisposed to land toe first. Although I have seen that corrected, just with more comfort. So heel first landings, think of that as like the physical therapy for the foot. So heel first landings are what's going to bring healing to that soft tissue and strengthen the shock absorber in the back of the foot, which is the frog and the digital cushion. When that's really strong, sometimes horses can forget the pathology they have. So even if they have, navicular bone damage, if they have a strong enough digital cushion to support their navicular bone, sometimes those horses can come back to full soundness without maintenance. I'm not saying that's in every case, but I've seen it happen enough times where I think that the key to really getting these horses comfortable is making sure that back half of the foot is really strong. And Dr. Bowker talks a lot about that too.
And that's where Clearfoot can be really helpful in helping horses reprogram their habitual patterns as well.
Right. So, heel first landings, I'm going to get a tiny bit technical, but just to explain where I'm coming from. Heel first landings allow proper full extension of the tendons up the back of the limb. So the deep digital flexor tendon and the superficial digital flexor tendon, these tendons are at full extension when the horse lands heel first, and that helps to stabilize the foot on impact with the ground. And this disperses the energy properly throughout the limb. So instead of landing in a way where the soft tissue and the bones and the joints aren't ready for that impact and that concussion, heel first landings allow for a way to disperse that concussion and that energy through the limb. So it can minimize the effects of concussion on those joints and soft tissue. And it also, just from that proper movement allows proper perfusion and circulation throughout the foot. And we know that circulation is what brings red blood cells and healing to different areas. And I already, so one last thing I wanted to say about landing. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes. So if a horse is toe first, I tell owners that you should not force movement. So you should not force exercise. So if your horse is toe first, you're filming in slow motion, closer to the ground, and you notice your horse is landing toe first, if you're forcing it to exercise, you're forcing it to move in ways that's damaging to its soft tissue and its joints. And ultimately that's going to lead to pathology instead of heal it. So we can go on to the next slide to talk a little or show some more examples of landings before we talk about how to get a heel first landing. So these are two examples from my own archives. The horse on the left, I was called in to do a consult for, and you can see that he's landing toe first, which is, I tried to freeze frame the video right before the point of impact and try to get it as close to the point of impact as possible. The horse on the right is my own gelding, my Mustang gelding, and I couldn't get it quite right when his foot hit the ground, but I can assure you he lands heel first on both fronts. And one thing I want to mention really quick is there are pathological, like unhealthy heel first landings, and you'll see that in laminitic or foundered horses, and it's usually pretty obvious, meaning the horse is very stiff and it's moving very stiffly through its shoulder. And before they land heel first, they almost like hover and are scared for the impact, but they're trying to land to avoid their toe. So they're sometimes super exaggerated heel first, but it looks painful. It doesn't look comfortable. And so you should, it should be pretty obvious if it's a pathological heel first landing, but you can probably ask your vet or farrier or hoof care provider to check.
Well, everybody pretty much has a video camera in their pocket these days that,
right.
Like my iPhone does slow motion so easily. And you can do that on your own, walking your horse down the barn aisle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's just a question of kind of figuring out the technique, but it doesn't matter if you do it bad because you can just do it again.
Right. Exactly. So pigeon-toed horses, that's horses that, have an angular limb deformity where their feet are turned in. I absolutely can have pigeon-toed horses landing heel first and mediolaterally balanced. I know that it really depends on their conformation up the limb and where the deviation started. But a lot of horses that toe in, I'll see them land laterally first. And you can't always correct that depending on how, depending on the degree of deviation in conformation. But I have seen horses with angular limb deformities end up landing comfortably heel first and balanced. And actually, if you go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about mediolateral landings. And somebody actually had emailed a question about this. So another thing to check for is if they're landing in front feet, if they're landing on both heels at the same time. And hind feet, this is something that Nick Barker taught me. Hind feet will have to land just due to the anatomy of the horse. Will have to land outside first, laterally first. But if you're filming your horse from the front, you can watch in slow motion to see how their heels are landing. Obviously, the horse is toe first. You're not going to be able to tell as much. But ideally, those heels are landing at the same time. And if they're landing one side a lot harder than the other, this can lead to soft tissue issues. So someone sent in a question about trim decisions based on that. And it's not, so this isn't really an owner, responsible, something the owner would be responsible for. But I'm really careful adjusting my trim based on their landings, because you can absolutely force a horse to land heel first with your trim, or force a horse to land flat, like mediolaterally balanced with your trim, and lame them because their structures are not strong enough to handle that landing yet. So if your horse is landing toe first and you force them to land force them to land heel first, where their heel is weak and their structures inside that are weak, you're going to make them really sore. So I don't like to give trim advice without seeing the horse in person. But for most horses, Pete Ramey has a really good balance article, and he talks about angular limb deformities like pigeon-toed horses. And a lot of horses that I see, the first time I see them, if I see they're really wearing down that outside heel and the inside hoof is really overgrown and flared because they're not wearing it, because they're landing laterally first, for example, Pete would balance that foot by not touching that outside and just, taking down that inside so that it matches the wear to the outside. This, might be great for one horse, and I've seen horses do really well with that. Some horses might need that flare to compensate for an injury or pathology in the limb, or their conformation. So it's really, really dependent on the horse. So I'm really hesitant to give trim advice.
I think it's fair to say that if you have a horse with limb deformities, it's really best left to a professional that recognize, because it's so easy to make a change, but it may not be the change the horse needs.
Right.
And, I had a horse that was incredibly pigeon-toed, and she was could do her job for many, many years. And we made sure we didn't interfere with her ability to do her job. Which,
right.
And so I think that, like you say, that's kind of a question left to the professional working with that individual, because it's such an individual thing.
Right, exactly. So like I do with filming to see if they're landing heel first, I'll film from the front to check how their progress is in medial lateral balance landings. And you can also use slow motion video in conjunction with what we call 0-degree DP rad, so dorsal palmar. So from the front, showing the balance of the limb from the front of the foot. And, you know, so I like to have that if I'm going to change anything in my trim, but I always go by the comfort of the horse, and using slow motion video is really helpful for that. And you might have a really weird looking foot that serves the horse really well. And if you try to make that foot look perfect, that horse is really lame. So, you know, definitely go by the comfort of the horse.
Nick had a great illustration in the webinar we did with her of a foot that one might look at and go, whoa, but the horse was sound. And, you know,
Right.
and so,
I met that horse in person.
Oh, did you? Oh, cool. Yeah. And that's the thing is, you know, there's certain things that, you know, there's a reason why they're there. And what I like about this talk is that it's what we can do, but there are things that, you know, again, it's very individual.
Right. The horse knows best for sure.
Yes.
In just a quick comment. So these two pictures were from this past week when I was at a friend's farm. We did a little clinic where we filmed horses' movement and then took x-rays, or the vet took x-rays, to see if what we were seeing in their movement matched what we were seeing on the x-ray. And you can see this horse on the left. I couldn't get it to freeze. She's actually very heel first. It looks like she's landing flat, but she lands really balanced medialaterally. The horse on the right lands hard laterally. So I don't know if you are on the outside. I don't know if you can tell that her whole foot is tipped to the outside in that image on the right.
Yeah, no, it's definitely clear.
Awesome. So we can go to the next screen.
Okay.
So how to achieve comfortable landings, you know, it's going to be different for different horses, but things that I always start with is diet, you know, making sure that diet is really good, and using boots and pads and treating for thrush. Those are like the three, like these need to happen if I'm going to pull shoes and this horse is uncomfortable and toe first. So this is actually screenshots from a video of a horse I met recently. And she has a really bad navicular diagnosis and has bone loss of the coffin bone due to chronic low-grade laminitis, and thin soles and a lot of issues going on, soft tissue damage. So these images that I took are minutes apart, and the only thing that changed was I put a pair of boots on, and I didn't touch her feet, didn't trim her. So this shows that the heel first landing was just coming from her comfort. She was then comfortable enough to land heel first just from those boots and pads. That's a cloud boot from Easy Care. I love them. If you're going to be, you know, pulling shoes or attempting rehab, they're really, really good. And I use them for 24/7 turnout. I try to get owners to take them off for an hour or so a day. Not all horses need them on 24/7. If I have like a laminitis case or a founder case, they most certainly usually do. So, you know, obviously slow motion video is really helpful. If you're going to film, use the slow motion feature on your phone. Don't film at normal speed and then slow it down, because the actual amount of frames that your phone is filming, is dependent on the speed that you're filming at. So if you have a regular speed video and slow it down, your whatever software you're using to slow it down will actually fill in the images based on kind of like what they think should be there. It won't be as accurate as if you're actually filming in slow motion. Yeah. And I like to film on a flat surface that's not uphill or downhill, because uphill will force a horse to land toe first because they're trying to, you know, get traction. Downhill will force a horse to land heel first. And if you're filming on an uneven ground, it can really affect how they're moving as well. So I try to film at the walk to start, because it isolates every single leg, and how each leg is landing, because it each lands on its own, you know, one at a time, in slow motion. So we can go to the next slide. So this image is showing a stretch. Another way that I think really helps with heel first landing, we get heel first landings, is through body work. And I am the first to admit, I know way too little about body work. And I fully, you know, I'll tell owners, I think this horse should have body work. but don't ask me about it because, ask your body worker. But one thing I'll always teach owners to do is this forward stretch here. If you're doing it, you want to be really careful not to ever force it, because forcing it can be very not great for their tendons and soft tissue. So I ask the horse to gently give me their leg in their own range of motion. I don't force it. And if the horse really likes that forward stretch, they'll sometimes lean into it and do a catch stretch. But a lot of horses that I see are really unwilling to do this at first because they've been landing toe first for so long and they don't even know how to fully extend their limb anymore. And over time I see them loosen up, get a better range of motion through that shoulder and through that limb. So I think
we've had a lot of webinars on body work, and Dr. Raquel Butler did one on stretches and stuff. So there's a lot of good resources on body work and stretches.
Yeah. So we can go to the next slide. So something I mentioned earlier, I think movement plays a much bigger role than I even give it credit for. Nick Barker has that rehab facility where she has a track system, which is basically instead of having a big open paddock, it's paths for turnout where the horses, when they're in a herd, the pressure, that they feel from that narrower space is forcing them to move more. A lot of people obviously can't build a track system. So I'll tell owners, space out their hay stations or space out their hay from their water. So they have to walk from one area to the other. Something I didn't add in this webinar, but I wanted to bring up is that a lot of times I'll even tell owners to add some pea gravel by the water. So every time they go to drink water, they're moving over a varied surface, and pea gravel is very comfortable for them if it's 4 inches deep. And that's going to stimulate their frog, stimulate their sole, and just allow that foot to get the stimulation it needs to get to grow healthier.
And it's amazing how little you need to do to interrupt a field to get them to move more. I just put up after one of Nick's webinars, I put up some pigtails with some electric fence, and instead of the horses standing in the shed all day long, they're out moving. And it was really not complicated, and it really didn't block off any of the field. It just changed where they go.
Right. Yeah. And so Dr. Andrew Van Epps, who I've had on the podcast before, he's done a lot of studies of perfusion, which is, circulation in the hoof capsule. And he has found through repeated studies that circulation improves it's actually circulation comes from cyclic loading, which basically means the horse picking up and putting down its foot. And how do they pick up and put down their foot? They're walking. So, if the more they're moving, the better the circulation is in the hoof capsule. And that's going to really affect not only their growth, but just, again, those red blood cells coming in and allowing things to heal in that hoof capsule.
Yep. And it doesn't have to be, some people think they have to make such an elaborate system to get the horses to move, but from what I've discovered, it really isn't that difficult. You just have to kind of create a couple of little roadblocks.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we can go to the next slide. So this is something that I touched on a little bit earlier, is that I care more about the horse's comfort than the appearance of the hoof. So in an attempt to make the hoof look correct right away, it's actually possible for us to cause discomfort and actually cause lameness when we're trying to fix lameness. So I always allow the horse to have the final say in whatever I do. So I try to watch the horse move before I work on it and after I work on it. Obviously, we want to be making progress and see the foot looking healthier, but I really care more about if my horses are comfortable after a trim or whatever I do than if their foot looks correct. Stephen Lee is a hoof care provider in the UK who's awesome. And he was on a podcast of mine a few weeks ago. And he said something like, I love seeing a perfect hoof, but I love seeing a sound horse an awful lot more. He talked about how the hoof isn't a block of wood that we can just carve to look however we want. The hoof is a living structure. So, it's going to respond to whatever we do to it. And I think that we do better to respect what it wants and what the horse wants than forcing our ideals on it. Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. So these are some, pictures that I have of me working with my local vet, who's awesome. And these are, both rehab cases. So something that's really, really going to impact the success of your horse's rehab is building a team that's going to be, actually communicating, working together well. So the first thing I tell owners, I kind of go through like a little bit of an interview process. I kind of make it hard for them to want to hire me. I tell them, I'm going to ask you to change things. And, it's not just me coming in and working on the feet and leaving. So find professionals that you can trust and that you agree with in terms of your belief system. If you want your horse to be in a therapeutic shoe package and ridden tomorrow, you want them to, be able to be in work full time while we're trying to rehab an issue, then I'm not going to be somebody that's going to work well with you, because I'm probably going to ask you to give your horse some time off and, grow in a better hoof capsule and see how they're moving with a better angle growth. So that would just be a constant battle if, we have different ideas of what we want for the horse. So find someone that jives with your belief system, and somebody that you feel like you can talk to and that you can trust and that you believe is actually helping your horse. Because if you feel like you have to tell your hoof care provider or your vet what to do, it's probably not going to be fun or pleasant for anyone, and the horse will suffer. So that being said, if you have people that you're working with that you really trust, don't be scared to ask questions. Me as a professional, I want to help my owners understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and, the decisions behind the choices that I make. Ask us to show you things, tell us if you see a change in your horse's soundness. Don't be scared to text me if the day after a trim, your horse is uncomfortable. That's feedback that we need, because that's telling us what the horse feels about what we're doing. So in the middle of a cycle, let your hoof care provider know if you notice something that's not great, or if you notice something great, like your horse is moving really comfortably, let them know. We like hearing those updates. Something I'll never say no to is radiographs. I love working with the vet to get x-rays. Both of these pictures are from when I was with the vet to get x-rays on a case. So this helps to determine if there's more internal pathology or issues that might need extra help and attention. It can also help us track progress, like sole depth or better angles. It can affect what we choose to do in terms of boots, or if we're doing glue-ons. The horse in the top picture is a client of mine. He was 14 years old, diagnosed with a navicular type issue, soft tissue damage, some ring bone. And we had accomplished a pretty healthy foot. Like his foot was actually growing in pretty well, and he was back in work. But certain days, he would randomly come up ouchy or like sore or a little bit off. And I was not satisfied with it's just the ring bone, or, it's just the navicular. I was like, no, his hoof capsule is healthy. I want to know why he's having sometimes where he feels great and sometimes not. I asked the vet, who probably thought I was insane, if we could test for PPID, and he was really high for PPID, which is Cushing's. And once he went on Cushing's medication, all of that lameness issues in between cycle went away. He's back in full work, full dressage work, barefoot. He's rocking it. He's got a much better top line now. He's much happier. And, I think that if you're not seeing the kind of progress that you'd expect, then don't be scared to test, get blood work done. And the last thing I'd say I really request of owners is to trust us on cycle length. If we're saying we really want to see your horse in X amount of weeks, don't say like, oh, can we make it a little longer? Or like, oh, I don't think they need that then. Because often we're trying to keep the balance of the hoof. We're not just, worried about the length of the hoof, but really the balance and how the horse interacts with the ground. And obviously there are cases, I do have some horses that almost self-trim. And, that's individual to the horse. But if your hoof care provider is telling you to keep a certain cycle, then I would definitely do that. So we can go to the next slide. So I rehab my horse while boarding. So I know that boarding your horse is tough when it comes to rehab. So I'll be the first to say that some boarding situations are just not conducive to hoof rehab. So you want to be, if you know you're going to go on to rehab your horse, you should talk to your barn manager and those that care for your horse. Ask them if they're willing to add the supplements. Ask them if they're willing to stop feeding grain and troubleshoot with you what will, get your horse to eat your supplements. If your horse especially is grass sensitive, see if there's options for non-grass turnout if needed. Really think about if your horse is able to get enough movement where they are. If you and your hoof care provider really feel that movement is going to bring their feet to the next level of health. Talk to your barn manager if they'll be willing to keep you updated on changes in your horse's comfort. So, really not all barns are going to be able to do that. So, it's really something that you have to think about and talk about with the people that are caring for your horse if you're boarding.
And sometimes, having a horse that needs a different care is a great opportunity to find a barn that's more aligned with your values.
Right, exactly. And there are those out there. I mean, I when my horse was diagnosed with navicular, I had to move him to a different barn because it was like I was hitting a wall. Every time I talked to my barn manager about ways that I really wanted to change some things for him, it was just, they couldn't do it. That's just the way things were done. And no hard feelings. I just moved him somewhere else. It was a different ideology. And I don't blame them for that. I just had to find a situation that worked for him.
Right. It's just an opportunity. It's not the. Somebody just asked a question about the horse had a diagnosis and now she's scared to push him. In other words, his sound, and he's been sound for a while, and she's scared to push him based on the diagnosis from 2018, 2 years.
So that's really, horse specific. If your horse is landing well, like movement is going to play a huge role, biomechanics. If your horse is landing well, I would treat them as if it was a horse coming back into work from any time off. So that means start with 5 minutes a day at the walk, then go up, bring them up X amount of minutes per day. And then once you've reached a certain amount of minutes per day at the walk, introduce the trot for X amount of time. And then once they're up to, half an hour of walk and trot, and you're going to do it systematically. And the second you notice any kind of setback, then you have to go back and reevaluate.
But not going there leaves you stuck. In other words, you've got to be able to be willing to go a little above the line and come back and see what happened.
Right. Nick Barker's first book, Feet First, she in the back of the book has a bunch of case studies of different horses, and she talks about how she brought them all back into work. It's going to be different depending on the pathology. I will say that ECIR recommends for laminitic horses that you should wait until a full new hoof capsule has hit the ground before you ride them again. So that's like 9 months. And I think a lot of people, once their horse is sound after laminitis, they just start riding and ECIR says you should really wait till that better lamina connection really hits the ground. Otherwise for other issues, I would just treat it individual to the horse and go by their setbacks. And a lot of times if they're moving well and you do it really sequentially, they can go from strength to strength. So
if you never go there, they can't improve. I mean, right. It's such a I talk about that a lot, about flirting with the line, where we have to go a little above and find out it's okay.
Right.
So we won't get trapped. Anyway.
Yeah. Next. So we just have one more slide. So someone just asked a question. So for navicular, I assume that you already follow Rockley Farm, but once the navicular damage is there, I mean, it'll likely be there for the rest of the horse's life. But like I said, if you're building up that digital cushion, like Dr. Bowker says, sometimes they can almost forget they have that pathology. And some horses that have awful navicular x-rays, tons of deterioration, degeneration, are sound and in full work, and they don't have any setbacks. Actually, I think one of the best things you can do is once you get a horse to a point where they're in full work and going strong is to keep that level of fitness, because once they have time off, then things can atrophy and you have to build that back up all over again. And it gives, it can have more of an issue of re-injury. Oh, Bowker.
I'm spelling it now. Dr. Bowker, it's Robert Bowker. And we've done 3 webinars with Dr. Bowker. They're all on the Surefoot Equine YouTube channel. They're all 2 hours long, just so that you're prepared. And we've actually taken the audio and pulled it off and made podcasts out of it, which you can find at Podbean, Wendy's Winnie's at Podbean. So if you want to just listen to them, you can find them there. I'll just put that in the chat too.
So this last slide is something that probably you'd think would be obvious, but it's not so obvious, is that you have to have patience. I know a lot of us want to see our horses sound immediately, but it took time for those hooves to become unhealthy, and it's going to take time for them to return to health. So, a hoof capsule, depending on how much they're moving, because obviously that affects circulation and perfusion, it can take up to, 9 months or more for them to grow out an entire new hoof capsule. And sometimes it can take that amount of time for you to see really positive changes. So, in the meantime, while you're waiting, I encourage owners to take lots of pictures, take lots of slow motion video to track progress. And that way you can see the little, incremental improvements, or you can see if something happened where you have a setback. You can know right away just from tracking with those pictures. So this mare in this picture, I met her in late 2018, I think the end of December 2018, and this owner, basically all she did was she changed the horse's diet and made the horse move more. And she went from being sore and ouchy. You can actually see in that left picture the bruising on the sole where it's actually pink instead of white. She had poor hoof quality that was chipping all the time, and she was really sensitive on different surfaces, to now the picture on the right. She's comfortable over all terrain. She has a healthier frog. Her soles don't bruise anymore. She's not ouchy. But this, it took time. So for encouragement along the way, movement versus via turnout. So this mare did get more turnout in the situation that we're talking about, but the owner actually, she was landing well. And so I told the owner to ride her. She was landing well and comfortable in the arena and on, surfaces that were soft. So I said, movement's going to be your best friend, ride your horse. She's sound on softer surfaces. And that, I think, made a big difference. So I know it's really hard and it can feel really isolating when you have a lame horse, because I was there. So I will say that, I mentioned a few Facebook groups, but one that I think can be really helpful is Hoof Care and Rehabilitation is a Facebook group. We kind of follow more of a Pete Ramey style of rehab, but it's just nice to have others in the group that are going through similar things. And, you can post pictures, videos, ask questions for help in troubleshooting your horse's soundness issues. And really, involve, build some friends around you that have been through something similar that can kind of help you along the way, and make sure that your hoof care provider and your professional team are a part of that. Talk to them. If we're in this job, I know that part of my job is hand holding. I knew that coming into it. I went through it too with my own horse. We're here to encourage you and help you, and we care about your horses. So we want to hear what's going on. And one last thing, I have had, I think I'm at episode 28 or 29 of my podcast. I've had some really cool guests talk about soundness and rehab. So if you look up the Humble Hoof Podcast, you can kind of scroll through and pick a topic that you think relates to your horse and listen to it, just to arm yourself with more knowledge. And that's basically it.
Yeah. It's awesome. And we also have, I've interviewed Daisy Bicking, Ida Hammer, Bob Bowker, now you, and we just keep adding other hoof care professionals to this webinar collection. So there's a lot of information available for people out there. And I think that's one of the things that's so different now than, I'm a little older than you. that we didn't have the ability to connect and talk to people around the world and find solutions. And that's one of the things that's really, really changed. And I think it's empowering a lot of people to be willing to actually even pick up a rasp and think about keeping that trim a little balanced, you know, after their health hoof care provider has shown them what to do, so that, you know, it's not sort of, I've been doing my own horse now for years just because of the circumstances I wound up in. But, you know, the more we learn and the more we educate ourselves, then the better it is for everybody, including our horses.
Yeah. And one last thing I want to say is that no one person has all the answers, and no one approach is going to help every single horse. So, you know, I truly believe that people know their own horses best, and talk to other people. Like, there are people that I've had on my podcast, and I'm sure there'll be more people that I've had on my podcast that don't do things the same way I do. And that doesn't mean that we care any less about horses, or want to see them, you know, we all want to see them sound. We all want to see them comfortable. We all want to help horses. So, that might look different for different situations.
Yep. There's a couple other questions here. We've done a webinar on therapeutic nutrition. We've had Nick Barker. So you can find that webinar. We've done 2 with her. It sounds like Alicia's really a big fan. She's known Nick, which is great. So that one's available. Let's see, removement. I've read that it needs to be more than just daily turnout, especially for IR horses. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So I think that's where, you know, doing something like a track system or the separate hay and water stations allows them to move more, you know, 24/7 turnout where it's an option. In terms of metabolic horses, it's exercise is part of the ECIR protocol. It's diagnosis, diet, trim, and exercise. Those are their order of operations, basically. And exercise can only happen when the horse is comfortable enough to do so. So if you have a metabolic horse that is sound at the moment, yes, the more exercise, the better, because that's going to really influence insulin levels and keep that horse more comfortable. Yeah, so, you know, that would be riding.
And walking my horse, because I need the exercise too.
Yeah, don't we all?
So a couple other questions. Is there iron in Redmond's rock? I think it's Redmond salt.
Yes. There was one product, and I'm blanking on the name. It's their gut one that was like 900 ppm of iron. And that I think I don't recommend it. I don't even know another way to say it in a better, like more politically correct way. But yeah, I don't recommend that.
Is
product.
It safe to use Artemud after doing white lightning soaks?
I actually never really thought about that. I have done it right after doing a white lightning soak and didn't really think much of it. So hopefully if I'm doing that wrong, somebody else can correct me.
Amy Chapman, I'm not sure. Could you please post her name? I'm not sure who her is at this point. If it's Nick Barker, maybe it's Nick Barker. Hopefully that's the right answer.
Dr. Kellen is the only, I'm trying to think of the other females I mentioned.
No, it's like, anyway, you can maybe go back and watch the webinar again. And this one, I maybe you understand this. I absolutely cannot find Feet First anywhere.
The book Feet First by Nick Barker, I've gotten it, or when I got it on Amazon.
Yes, actually I got it on Amazon too, and it comes from the UK, so you just have to be patient.
Yeah, but if you can't get it, if you go to Nick's website, Rockley Farm, I don't even know if it's rockleyfarm.com, but if you contact them, I'm sure that they have it it's
probably where it comes from when they ship it, because mine came from the UK. And do you need to get blood work on your horse along with hay analysis? My horse is suspect metabolic.
I will always suggest blood work if you think your horse is metabolic, because that's the only way to get a true diagnosis. And you can have things in the blood work that are sabotaging all of your rehab efforts, like the high ACTH from Cushing's or high refractory insulin that isn't responding to diet. So I would always recommend blood work if you suspect metabolic issues.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've gotten through all the questions. There's been a lot of questions on this one. It's great. And this has been fabulous. I mean, it's you know, in so many ways, what you've done is you've taken information from a lot of people and really made it usable for someone. Because we've had Nick, we've had Bob. I haven't had Pete Ramey yet. I'm going to have to see if I can have him come on the show.
He's great.
But you know, that's the thing is I think sometimes we all need to hear these things. Like what I'm hearing again for me is, okay, I really got to go out and look at my feed. Like I'm on a fiber diet, not me, you know, he's a hay diet and that sort of thing. But, you know, maybe it's time that I really, and after Nick, I've been supplementing with magnesium and salt, but I think I need to go back and look at that balance again. And that's what I keep hearing from you. So it's been really great because sometimes we need to hear it more than once before it really clues in, and
yeah,
that's what we need to do.
Yeah, definitely. And these are things I need to remind myself of too. So.
Oh, well, absolutely. I can't, you know, like I have friends and they're holistic and they do something. I'm like, have you taken arnica? And they go, oh, I completely forgot, you know,
Yeah.
So sometimes we need someone to remind us. So somebody just posted, it's rockleyfarm.co.uk. And Nick's fabulous. We've had her twice. It was really fun. Allison, I want to thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me.
Really fabulous and great information for people. And it's just been a really pleasure to meet you because, you know, I've obviously haven't met you in person yet. So maybe with someday that'll happen.
Yeah, definitely. I know if we ever can go to Equine Affair again, I'll stop by your booth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe some year. But anyway, in the meantime, we have the webinars, and just remember you can find this and all of the other 122 now webinars with Wendy on the Surefoot Equine YouTube channel. They're there, they're free. You can listen to them. We're making podcasts out of the ones that make sense to just have audio. And that's you can find on Podbean, Wendy's Winnies. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, Alicia, for being my guest. And we don't have one tomorrow. It's election day. Please go vote.
All right. Thanks again.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.